thank you to, first of all, to the World Justice Project for giving our panelists, and giving all of you the opportunity to discuss what's likely to be a very interesting topic, sustainable water solutions and the rule of law. And by discuss, I mean discuss. This isn't a series of talking heads up here. I'd like us all to sort of get in the mindset of, particularly with a relatively small group like this, let's pretend we're all sitting around a circle. And I intend to bring the audience into this conversation as quickly as I possibly can here. So thank you all for being here. On behalf of our panelists here, I want to welcome you to Sustainable Water Solutions and the Rule of Law. Our evil plan for the next hour and 45 minutes or so is simply to explore the intersection between the rule of law and global development challenges, with a particular emphasis on water. Water sanitation and hygiene, transboundary water issues, water in conflict, and so on. And I'm personally honored to be here and humbled to chair a session with such esteemed panelists. On my immediate left is Anders Jagerskog of the Stockholm International Water Institute, with which I imagine many of us are familiar. To his left is Mrs. Ebele Okeke, the Water and Sanitation Ambassador from Nigeria. To her left is Gidon Bromberg of the Friends of the Earth Middle East. And then finally, Scott Rickards of Waterfund LLC in the United States. To help us on the panel target our remarks a little bit, let me just try to figure out who you are as well. Are there any lawyers in the audience? That was a joke and a question, so thank you for playing along there. How about any judges? Judges, great. Nonprofit executives. Is this helping? Helping me. Corporate sector, for-profit executives. Got a couple. I expected Scott to raise his hand on that one. Academics? Great. And who here works for well, there's a lot of gray area in between these here, these sort of a false dichotomy. Folks who work for governments or have worked for governments in the past. Okay. Thank you for that. That helps me, one, make sure everybody's awake, and B, helps me target some of my even opening remarks in framing this discussion. Now, to frame the next hour and 45 minutes just a bit, I see rule of law, rather broadly defined, as an enabler, as a catalyst of good, sustainable development assistance, of truly sustainable, truly institutionalized progress toward global development challenges, including safe drinking water and transboundary water issues and so on. The Millennium Development Goals, which is one of the things this panel was asked to address, will not happen without rule of law. The Sustainable Development Goals, the post-2015 goals, whether it's for water or anything else, will not be met unless the progress towards those goals is institutionalized based on a solid rule of law foundation. But I also see more progress on development challenges, including water, as one of many ways to strengthen rule of law. So I see it going both ways, this bridge between rule of law and water. Now, one example I'll offer to you from the very opening plenary, one of the most interesting questions that was asked, in my opinion, was, is there a primary school for rule of law? Has anybody come up with an answer to that question? Because I got one. I'd suggest that a primary school for the rule of law is a village water committee. Think about that for a second. A village water committee, oftentimes, many times the first experience that a local person, a rural woman, has with participatory democracy anywhere in the world, but particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, many times that woman's first experience with participatory democracy, with open government, is via her or his village water committee. Via his or her participation on local committees in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in their slums, on a block or a small village designed to address local challenges with local solutions. Now, Tip O'Neill, a famous American politician who's been quoted a couple of times here, said all politics is local. Well, I agree, and all development challenges are local. That's particularly salient. All development is local, is particularly salient in the water sector, where, as we'll discuss today, water is heavy. Water costs a lot of money to move from one place to the next. So if all politics are local, then I'd like to assert that all water is local as well. And that might be a more controversial statement than I realized just on the panel here. So let's say that village water committee in rural India is a primary school for rule of law. A school hand washing committee in Guatemala is a primary school for rule of law, where children get their first taste of participatory democracy, even in a 4th or 5th grade primary or elementary school setting. An HIV support group in South Africa or Tanzania or Botswana is a primary school for rule of law, as they figure out how to work together to solve their own problems themselves within their communities, but then reaching out more broadly and more broadly to involve formal government, to become more comfortable with their involvement with their more formal or less informal government representatives at the municipal, at the provincial, even at the federal level in these countries. You know, a women's neighborhood group focused on sanitation in the Kibera slum of Nairobi or in Manila is a primary school for rule of law. So that's the first thought that I'd offer you in sort of framing this conversation here. These water committees, these school boards, these health committees and the like all give folks all around the world an opportunity, sometimes their first opportunity, to participate in local democracy building. Now, the water challenges that we'll discuss today, the local challenges, the national challenges, the transboundary, even the global challenges, all of these challenges offer individuals at various levels every opportunity to involve themselves directly or indirectly in governance, in rule of law, in simply strengthening the social contract between individuals and their governments at all levels. Again, I do water. I'm interested in the water and rule of law nexus simply because I see water as not just as something that's strengthened by rule of law, but I see water as something that strengthens rule of law, that helps to institutionalize rule of law from the very lowest levels on up. Now, I've heard a lot of times, I'm the water guy, we're all the water guys, and I've heard a lot of times over the last couple of days, oh, you're on the water panel. Well, have you heard that water is likely to be the cause of the next world war? It's like, yeah, I've heard that. And although it's certainly widely perceived that water will cause the next series of wars, it hasn't so far. Water hasn't caused a war, give or take, for 4,500 years between two city-states in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley there. And I wasn't around for that, so I'm really not even sure what happened then. Water certainly causes conflict, but water brings people together, brings families together, brings communities together at a local, at a national, at a regional, at a global level. And frankly, I not only do I hope that to remain the case, but I expect that to remain the case. And that water bringing people together is happening in many cases around the world because of the work of these four organizations up here on the panel today. And I want to acknowledge that right up front and thank you all for your efforts on behalf of transboundary and national and local water challenges. So this panel, I hope, will bring the world of rule of law into, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, into the real world. Like the session this morning tried to bridge the world of development challenges, of tangible, concrete development challenges, with a more esoteric, academic, perhaps overly legalistic approach to rule of law that many of us in this room are guilty of. So this panel seeks to address the relationship between citizens and their governments of all types, at all levels, not just a federal level, but a subnational level and a local level all around the world. We're interested in your help in moving this conversation from the more esoteric very much to an on-the-ground discussion about how rule of law can help solve water challenges and vice versa. We're interested in taking this conversation from a human rights debate. Is water a human right or is water not a human right? I'd rather spend less time on that debate and more time on discussing about the best way to progressively realize the human right to safe drinking water and to sanitation, and oftentimes these days the constitutional right to water and to sanitation, another bridge between the rule of law and development challenges, including water. You know, at its most simple, a number of us will address this today, you know, when people receive a service from their governments, they're more willing to pay for that service through taxes or through tariffs. And when governments provide those goods and services, when governments receive such taxes, they're more likely to provide those goods and services in a more sustainable fashion, The ultimate example in the water sector being perfectly safe drinking water delivered to every room in your house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it takes time to get to that level. So I see the rule of law strengthening the water sector. I see progress in the water sector strengthening the rule of law and the efforts that many of your organizations are making. And if you still have doubts about how important water is, I think there's no better place than The Hague to have this conversation. Because Prince Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, of course, is one of the world's most foremost water and sanitation advocates. Well, I think primarily because of his strong advocacy for water and sanitation, of course, he recently received a promotion. And now he's king, Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, so based entirely on his water and sanitation advocacy, I think. So there's hope for all of us here. I'm going to stop there before I steal any of the thunder from our panelists here today. We have 4 speakers, really 5 speakers, because I'll make a few remarks in a second here. What we've agreed to is that each of our panelists will make 5 to 8 minutes of opening remarks, and then I want to bring you in, think of this circle again, immediately after our first speaker here for another 5 minutes of questions and answers for each of the speakers as we go along, rather than waiting until the end for a longer Q&A period, which we'll also have. Does that work for you guys? Good? Great. Well, then, and I have a treat. Were any of you in the 1994 election in South Africa? Were any of you there at that point? The election that saw the ANC and Nelson Mandela come to power. We have to agree on how to award this, but we have a door prize here today, which is an official ballot paper from the 1994 election in South Africa, the national ballot paper, which is basically a work of art in and of itself. So we'll figure out a way to award that to the most insightful, not the longest, certainly, but the most insightful intervention, frankly, from anybody in the room. So that's a challenge. Anders Jagerskog, you're on.
Okay. Thanks a lot, John, for the introduction, and thanks to the World Justice Project for inviting me. I'm not a lawyer. I'd like to start by saying that. I'm a political scientist, so my comments will hopefully add to the knowledge that I know is in the room and here in the panel. And it'll be slightly different then. Just 10 seconds on my background. I work at the Stockholm International Water Institute, heading up the Transboundary unit. I also spend about half of my time for UNDP in working on trying to get states in more conflictive regions of the world to work together on sharing a river, sharing a lake, and so forth. The Nile being one example. And I'd like to touch upon 3 main things here. First, I'd like to give the broad flyover of transboundary waters. With Gidon, we'll go into more of contextual analysis and discussion in his remarks, I think, in the Jordan River context. Then, as number 2, I'd like to sort of sketch the debate. John was already touching upon that in his remarks over the thinking around transboundary water. Is it a source of conflict, war, cooperation, or perhaps all of those things? And then finally, finishing off with the new, as I see them, emerging issues of relevance and importance for transboundary waters. So those 3 things I hope to cover in my 5-minute intervention here. The overview of transboundary waters. I mean, basically half of the available fresh water globally is in transboundary or are transboundary of nature, so meaning that they are shared by 2 or more countries. There are some 267 and counting rivers that are shared. There are more than that, over 300 aquifers that are shared. And this is still ongoing research into. So there would be additions also to the aquifers being the groundwater that are being shared by countries, and there are numerous lakes that are also being shared. So that tells you something about the magnitude of the problem. In many places it's not so sensitive. In my part of the world, we share rivers with Norway and Finland. We share the Baltic Sea also with more neighbors in Europe. It's not a very sensitive issues. That's partly because we have good relations, relatively good relations with our neighbors, but also because we have quite a lot of water. In other parts of the world, I'm thinking particularly of the Middle East, but also Africa, parts of Asia. That's not the case. Both relating to the political relations between those countries, but also to the scarcity of the water. In terms of international water law, and here I'm not going into details, some of you here knows a lot more than me on this, but there is a convention. This is the 1997 convention on it is called the Law of the Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses. Long and complicated name. It's been ratified, I think, today by 30 countries, or there may be 31 coming. It needs 35 countries to enter into force. But lots of credits going to different NGOs, but primarily WWF, that has been campaigning vigorously for this convention to enter into force. The principles enshrined in this convention was negotiated and discussed over a period of 40 to 50 years, and are now being picked up in new agreements, not straight off, but in many aspects in new agreements that are entered into between countries. There's also another convention that has just gone global, and that's the UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which has a commission on transboundary water, which mirrors, but it's not exactly the same as the 1997 convention, which is global, has always been global. But this has now also gone global. So there's an interesting, for you lawyers in the room, discussion going on as we speak on how one can perhaps combine those two conventions, not formally, but how do they interlink? What are the interdependencies between them? What are the problems, the challenges that this will bring? I'm not touching more upon this here, but that's a pointer for research. A lot of research, I think, is needed to further analyze and understand this. Then, sketching briefly the debate on transboundary waters over the last 3-4 decades. As John was saying, you've also probably heard that water may be the source of, or will be, the source of the next world war or the next war in the Middle East. There are significant people that have been saying that. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, for one, and King Hussein of Jordan has also said that water is the only reason he'll go to war with Israel again. There are other examples. And based on that political rhetoric, but also based on researchers seeing that, well, in these countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, there isn't enough water to produce the foodstuff that we need in our countries. Many draw the conclusions, yes, there will be a war over water. That, as John has pointed out, has not happened. It is, in my view, unlikely to happen. And I will provide some reasons for that. And that's mainly relating to that there's been an overemphasis on the political statements made by these leaders. It's been taken for face value, while in my political analysis of it, it's rather saying in these countries in Middle East, North Africa, by saying that you will go to war, you rather would like to communicate that you deeply care about these resources. The water is important in terms of the relation to domestic constituency. Another reason is, of course, that the researchers that sort of looked on the food-water balance in the region did not acknowledge, or at least not to a sufficient extent, the global food market. What we've been seeing since the 80s, 90s is that there's been an increasing import of food into the region to ameliorate the water scarcity. So coming back at one of your original comments here, John, that water is heavy. Well, it's not so heavy if you import a kilo of rice from Asia to the Middle East, for example. By importing that, you will import about, depending on the climate, of course, 3,000 to 4,000 liters of water. If you import a kilo of wheat, you import 1,000 liters of water. So those figures and that understanding was not there originally. Anyway, in the early 2000s, late 90s, it was increasingly understood that, yes, water is perhaps rather a source of peace. And the pendulum swung from this side to that side, and water was seen as, you know, the reason for countries to seek peace and work together. And that's partly true, as Gidon will tell us. But perhaps, you know, it swung from that side to that side a bit too quickly, and there wasn't enough analysis and understanding in how water can contribute to peace. I believe that water can contribute to peace, but there is no direct linkage between agreeing, for example, on a treaty of water and then seeing all the other issues coming into line. And I think the Jordan Basin is a good example of that. So the pendulum swung. And in the last 5 or so years, sort of realizing that perhaps, well, the water wars thesis was not correct, well, the water for peace was not solidly true as well, and now there is more of a focus on trying to understand what quality of cooperation do we see. Is the cooperation fair? Is it just? Is it equitable? And what are the mechanisms that sort of delineate or make these agreements more just or less just? And here we come into a lot of political perspectives looking at the power imbalances, and that is not, I'm not talking only about, you know, military power imbalances, but economic, in terms of human resources. If you look on the Middle East, North Africa again, you can see that some of the countries have skilled negotiators to the extent that the other countries may not have. Compare a country like Burundi with Egypt, for example. The expertise in the Egyptian cases is, you know, here, and Burundi at least started down here. We see a bit of leveling of the playing field happening, but that is also something that can tell us a bit about the quality of the cooperation and whether it's just and fair and so forth. And what we see often in river basins and when countries share aquifers and lakes is that we see both conflict and cooperation happening at the same time. You have this sometimes fierce rhetoric happening at the political level, high political level, I should say. But then on the local level, you may have good cooperation on between, and Gidon probably will touch upon this as well, between two mayors on two sides of the Green Line in the Jordan Basin, for example, collaborating and wanting to find the best way in how to treat the sewage and so forth. So an increasing realization that conflict and cooperation coexist. Then to my third point then, and here I also have 3 sub-points, the new and emerging issues. And I don't pretend to cover everything here, but some of the things that I see at least is, and one being the climate change. We all know that climate change will affect us and hit us. In terms of transboundary relations and the risk for conflict and cooperation, and how it affects is that many of the agreements that we see today are based on multi-year averages. You get X million cubic meter, I get you know, Y. But with climate change happening, we don't know exactly how it will play out in many regions, but what we know is that the variations, the climate variability will increase. Some years you will get a lot less, some years you will get a lot more. And some regions will get a lot more, some regions will get a lot less. Therefore, many of the agreements today are not flexible, and they may be in need of renegotiation. And that is also a tall task, I would say. Many agreements will become obsolete in the sense that the figures that are in the agreements are not relevant any longer. That's one thing. The second thing I'd like to highlight is also been discussed in the conference also, the issue of land grabbing or land acquisition. That's happening at large scale in Africa, primarily, but also in Asia and other regions, Latin America, for example, where foreign countries, foreign companies, hedge funds, and others invest in land for primarily food security, but also biofuel purposes in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, Liberia, Sierra Leone, at a large scale. What we've been seeing when doing research into this issue is that often the water is taken for granted. It's not even in the agreements. While, of course, if you want to grow food in these countries, of course, water is needed. but it's taken for granted. This, of course, affects the local level, the national level, pastoralists and so forth, but it also will affect the transboundary level in the sense that the water that's being taken by these players, India, China, but also European countries being main investors, also US companies being investors, they will become new sort of hydropolitical players in the sense that that adds another layer of complexity and demands on whether it's Ethiopia in the Nile context to deliver the water, which could then strain relations with their neighbors in the Nile. A lot of more research is needed there. A final thing then is relating to the water, food, energy nexus. What we see now with increasing population growth, with more of the global population moving into middle class, thereby demanding more energy, more water, and so forth, is that they're increasing competition also within countries, but still also between countries, between different sectors, between the water sector, the food sector, and the energy sector. And exactly how those trade-offs are stricken is I think we will see that play out and maybe leading to conflict also at the international level more. I think I stopped there. I think I didn't run over the 8 minutes.
Not too much.
Not too much. Okay.
That was fine.
Okay,
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. You guys are up. Your turn. Some immediate urgent questions for Anders here. I've got a whole list. Don't make me use these. Who's first? You guys have questions? Let me run one by you real quick here, just to prime the pump a little bit. I'm interested in a couple of things, Anders. First of all, if you want to quickly elaborate on virtual water. And water is heavy, but rice, 1 kilo of rice weighs 4,000 times less than the amount of water it takes to make that rice. To what extent is that part of the solution to solving the global water equation? But the other thing I want to pick up on is you mentioned sort of the institutional capacity of Egypt to manage its water resources versus the institutional capacity of Burundi to manage its water resources, and they're all in the same sort of riparian area there. To what extent is there an opportunity for the rule of law community, for lawyers, for judges, for senior government ministry officials to level that playing field in other riparian basins, in other river basins around the world? If you want to respond to either of those just very quickly before we move on to Mrs. Okeke.
Yes, of course. Virtual water being part of the solution. Yes, I mean, in the case of North Africa, Middle East, it's been part of the solution, and it will continue to be part of the solution. But that, of course, requires that you can produce the food needed in those regions elsewhere. And there is some, some hesitation to see, in terms of will we eventually be able to produce all the food that we need in the future in order to be, and then trade it to the right regions. Mm-hmm. Some say it's not likely, and that we do have enough water, but the problem is it's a water quality problem, which becomes a financial problem because we need to clean the water in order to be able to use it to irrigate. So the debate is still ongoing whether we will have enough water. I think most of the researchers are saying that yes, we do have enough water, but it depends then again on how we use it. Institutional capacity, of course, the legal community can contribute tremendously to some of these less developed countries in other river basins by providing training, capacity building, which is much needed. It is happening, but it could happen at a larger scale, I think.
Do you want to give a couple of examples of other river basins where you think that might be the lowest hanging fruit?
Yes. One example would be perhaps it's a very sensitive region again, but in the Euphrates-Tigris region, primarily, well, Syria may now need it again, but Iraq needs some training there, according to themselves. Mm-hmm. Syria may need it again in their relation to that region. Mm-hmm.
Scott, did you have something to add?
I just have one question for Anders. you've characterized the role of private actors, hedge funds, multinationals, sort of I think you used the word land grabbers, and at the same time you said part of the solution to a greater supply of clean water is in the financial aspects of how these large projects are funded. So is it possible that part of the solution may come from private actors such as the ones you mentioned? And if so, what's a constructive way, in your view, private actors can can participate in large-scale projects in the developing world, in Africa and elsewhere?
Thanks. Yeah, I used the term land grabbing a bit. I should have been more careful. We want to use the term land acquisition. Land grabbing is the most widely used. I think land acquisition can be both good and bad, and it depends on whether the companies or countries that invest follow, some type of code of conduct. There are the responsible agribusiness investment, the so-called RIE principles. If those are followed, which they aren't always, then I think it could be a good contribution to the developing countries. But unfortunately, what we have seen up until today is that in most cases it hasn't been positive. But that's not a given. That could be changed, I think. Okay. And thereby the private actors can really contribute.
Let's take one question from the audience here and then move on to Mrs. Okeke.
Thank you very much, Hans, for the legal counsel view, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I'd say that one thing, when you adjudicate water cases, maybe you should have special courts. I had the privilege of serving on the Swedish Water Board for 1 year in 1973, and that was an extraordinary learning experience. We had not only lawyers, but also an engineer on the bench. We needed an engineer, a man of the lawyers, to be able to understand everything. I have a question that relates to the convention. Suppose there were 2 Americans who should be given credit for the water courses agreement, Stephen Caffrey and Bob Rosenstock, they were the rapporteurs in the International Commission. There are elements here. First of all, have you studied the desertifications in connection with your work and what you think that this will mean? Is it working? Ah, sorry. Isn't it working?
We could hear you.
We could hear you.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm very sorry. I thought it was working. The desertification issue. The second issue is Dubai. I visited Dubai for the IBA meeting a couple of years ago, and there I saw signs where they were boasting about using 74 million gallons of desalinated water every day to water the golf courses and the gardens. And that brought to my mind an ethical issue here. Is this how energy should be used when people are not having access to drinking water? And lastly, is there any realism in transporting water via icebergs? And if you look at Antarctica, it's a continent of 14 million square kilometers, where 90% of the freshwater resources on the globe are frozen. Is there any realism in thinking that one could bring drinking water and water for household purposes from Antarctica? Thank you.
Okay, quickly then. Desertification, we haven't really looked into that in detail. It's probably something we should do, but we haven't done that in detail. Your second comment there on desalination and Dubai. Yeah, I mean, Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, they have the highest per capita consumption of water in the world, I think. All desalinated. Requires enormous amounts of energy. For them, that's not a problem in the sense that they do have, they do have access to cheap oil. But yes, of course, it's an ethical issue and a moral issue, and you can't go on for that forever. Transportation of ice. It's been thought about, and various ideas on how to do that has been put forth. But I think coming back then to the virtual water idea, the logic of transporting ice from where you have the ice to the places where you need it is not economically viable and feasible if you compare to just importing that kilo of rice or kilo of wheat. And I should say that in many of these countries, about 80% in the Middle East, not all of them, but if you take an average, 80% of the fresh water is allocated to irrigation. So the drinking water proportion in any country, I would say, is very small if you compare to all the other things. So you will always have drinking water. So and then you can import to substitute.
Scott, let's keep that open if you don't mind. So I want to move on.
I'm just going to comment on the two questions, okay. Particularly the Dubai question and what you mentioned about transporting bulk water. I had the opportunity actually to, on behalf of the government of Dubai, research the investability of buying basically water rights in glaciers in Patagonia, and the decision was very clear. It was far more expensive to do that than to desalinate seawater. So it comes down to cost on most major infrastructure decisions, and importing water is just prohibitively expensive vis-a-vis the alternatives.
Great, thank you. Mrs. Okeke, you're on.
Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Minister of Water Resources, if you look in your program, she's the one who's supposed to be here, Mrs. Sarah Ochepa. But on Thursday morning, she phoned me and said that she's been given a very serious national assignment. So she invited me to come and represent her. And I'm happy to be here. For the WASH sector, that is water supply and sanitation sector, it's quite gratifying to note that the United Nations have concluded that it is a human rights sector. So it is important that no matter the place you live, you must have access to water supply, and the water supply must be affordable, and it must be sustainable. Now, if we all want to have sustainable water supply, remember that water supply is life and sanitation is dignity. If you want to have access to this, everybody must be involved. The government, the private sector, the consumers, the civil society, everybody must be involved. And as I'm representing the Minister of Water Resources, let me talk on the side of government. A lot of things are expected of government. The government must make sure that you have enabling environment for this sector. She must have policy. There must be policy, national policy for water and national policy for sanitation. There must be the legal framework in place and also regulatory framework. Now, if you want to make sure, the government has to make sure that the poor, because it's okay to have water, but you find that most of the time, the poor people do not have real access. So the government has to make sure that no matter the place you live, no matter how poor or vulnerable you are, you must have water. And she can only do this by making sure she puts enough investment in the sector. Now, she must make sure also that, there's no free meal. Let us have it behind our minds. There's no free meal. If you must have water, you have to pay for it in cash or in kind. So the government has to make sure that you have, first of all, know how much does anybody, the various groups earn, and now have the adequate tariff for that sector, for each group. Government also has to make sure that you have innovative funding. There's no way government can fund everything, and these days it is obvious that you have to bring in the private sector to invest. In Nigeria in February, our government quickly had a workshop. We had some international participants who came to look at innovative funding for water supply and sanitation. Then you must have innovative technology. You must have affordable technology. Technology that can help the poor and the rich in getting water. Now, one area that is often neglected is the issue of sanitation. Sanitation, no matter the amount of water you have, if that water, if your sanitation facility is bad, like if you don't wash your hands and you handle the water, then that water is as good as not being there. It's as good as going to the pond to have your water. Sanitation is something that most people ignore. We all talk of, if you see outside, it says water solutions, but it's actually water, sanitation, and hygiene solutions. Now, there are simple things you have to do, like Nigeria. Nigeria has one of the highest infant mortality rates, and this should not be the case. This can be, it's a preventable situation, and this can be done by making sure that right from the grassroots, right from the children, people learn how to have proper sanitation and hygiene activities, within their homes and within the school. I remember it was being discussed in one of the sessions. I think poverty we were discussing. I don't think most people realize how many how many of these children, the girls, that drop out of school because of simple things as sanitary conditions of the environment. In the schools, you won't believe that in some schools, not even in the villages, right in the cities, you might have you might have 2 toilets for about 300 children. Of course, the children end up, having very poor sanitary condition, and the girl child, when she's menstruating, will not come to school. So these are things that we have to look at. We must all take our life into our hands, whether you're in the village or whether you are in the city. Collaboration, government must make sure that there is collaboration within the partners. And that is why the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council, which is within the UN system and is based in Geneva, when they invited me, when I left government, and invited me to look into high advocacy for them in Nigeria as the water ambassador, I was very glad to do it because you'll be surprised that most people, I'm sure even people who are here, do not realize the importance of water and sanitation in the sector. I'll leave it here.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Okeke. Yes, please. Is there a mic? Great, thanks.
I'm happy to be here. I'm Beatrice Boma from the USA, originally from Cameroon. Most of what you've been discussing has been about the governments and how they have, when you actually started to say, you said that village water community is the primary school of the rule of law. Mm-hmm. I want to bring, what I say is how can we bring water, make water accessible to the villagers? Instead of passing through governments, because passing through governments, there's going to be corruption, there are going to be blocks all over the place, and it won't work. I, as somebody who came from Cameroon and from a village where people go to stream to carry water, and it's dirty water, and children get sick from water, and they use the water for everything. My whole idea is how can you help me to supply filters that I can give to my villagers so that when they go carry a bucket of water, they can insert it into their water to make it clean for them to be able to use it. That's my problem, because if we have to go through the government, it's going to be a big project that might take years. I would want to save somebody's life today rather than making it complicated by passing it through the governments, because the rule of law is the people, and you said if the people don't live the rule of law, it cannot be. So it's a primary thing, and I want us to make it as simple and as easy as possible. Mm. I need filters that I can give to villagers, that they can insert into their buckets of water and use it each time that they go and carry water, because the very water that they use for drinking, it is the water that they use for bathing, it is the water that they use to farm with. As soon as they get out of their farms, they get into that water. And really, I'll be very grateful if you can help me do something about this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I've heard what you said. Giving water to the villagers, it doesn't mean that you can actually avoid government, but the issue is in most countries you have the local government authorities, and it is their work to make sure that they bring in the communities to provide water. The communities, like I said, everybody has to be on deck. The communities might not have the technological know-how of how to drill a borehole or how to have a pipe water system. It is the local government that can put it, but the community now takes over. You have the community water supply associations, whereby you have the women and some of the men taking care of the water that is provided. To say that you should not involve government might not be the solution. The solution is for everybody to know what is right and do it. If government, the municipal government, puts in water, or if a private organization puts in water in the village, if the villagers do not come together and make sure that they guard the facility and they operate and maintain it, then you won't have water. So it is a collaborative action.
I'm actually from Cameroon. I'm not from Nigeria.
I know Cameroon.
And when you're talking of the community, villagers they don't even have the know-how as to how to go about it, because primarily you grow up in a situation where a mother gets up in the morning, gets water for the family. And it's a distance sometimes to bring this water from where it is to their homes. This water is used for cleaning, for washing clothes, for everything. And you know how corrupt the third world country is. If you want not to start passing it through people, it's going to cause more problems than... I would want you to give me a big tank of water, if possible. But that is something that is going to ask for a lot of money, it's going to ask for a lot of time, it's going to break the government to be able to do that. And I see from where I'm sitting, that is going to be so complicated. All I need is you to help me start with something that is concrete, give them water filters so that they can start at that level before you start teaching them, if at all it will be possible, how to be able to access and clean their own water. Because the only way that I have for now is, please, thank you.
Well, yeah. let me throw in my 2 cents here. I mean, it's a very interesting debate you bring up. It's easier to directly provide services, and there's a lot of organizations throughout the international donor community that do exactly that. I can't comment on the status of the government in Cameroon. I'm aware of its upsides and its downsides, let's put it diplomatically. And I'm also aware that it's oftentimes very difficult and time-consuming and labor-intensive and expensive to work through governments. But the flip side of that is, it's something that I face on a daily basis as a member of the international donor community. Do we just go in there and directly provide services, or do we indirectly provide services through the government of a country, a province, or a municipality, thereby providing the services while strengthening the present and future capacity of that same governing authority to continue to provide those services? So there's no right answer to this question, but I'm happy to take the conversation about if there's a direct opportunity in Cameroon. I'm happy to take that offline and see if I personally have any ideas. I wanted to get to 2 more questions here. In fact, one from our Cameroonian friend and one from our Nigerian friend up front here. And then we're going to move on, if that's okay, to Gidon.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm Barthelemy Chemnan from Cameroon. I do agree with my Cameroonian sister for what she have just said. But I think also one point that I can add on that is also the lobbying aspect of it. Because some community in Cameroon do their effort to get a community water, but Cameroon keep invest a lot of money in a company that has already been supplied to a foreigner country. For example, the water company in Cameroon has been bought by the Moroccan, I think a Moroccan company, and Cameroon keep invest a lot of money while the community water which Cameroonian or community had made effort to provide in their quarter, but pumping machine has a small problem. We cost less than 100,000, but the local government in the area, which is the council, is not able to provide that 100,000 francs for that company to put the machine on. And you realize that every year the water problem becomes very crucial in many remote areas in our country. And we think that through the partners, something should be done to put pressure on government to see how to allocate every year in every remote region who has community water some certain amount to maintain the functioning machine of that area. Because you see, even though the company has been sold to somebody, Camon is investing a lot of money, which could have even built a lot of community water in the region.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
Yeah.
Please.
I know that, you see, I don't really know why, from what I'm hearing from Cameroons, whether they want, it's because you have to move. You cannot remain at the rudimentary of being given filter to do personal filtering of your water. I believe that every country went through that stage, and it is for that country and the people in that community to move on and bring up their life. You can't continue having small buckets you treat in your house. You must have water for the community, and the community must take their lives into their hands. The community must be trained. Even if they don't speak English, you can train them, and they will know that it is their life. That is part of the rule of law. They will know that it is their life. When you have women in the water communities, you have women, normally you make the women the treasurers, because you know that if you give them the money, they will make sure that whatever is put there, they will use it for the water treatment. I think we should move above, just having household filters and things like that.
Thanks. One more quick question from Demis up here, and maybe a quick response, and let's move on to Gidon. Can the rest of you hold on to your questions?
Thank you. Demis Melafia from Nigeria. My question goes to the first speaker. You talked about the possibility of a conflict that some people have highlighted in the sharing of the other speaker, yes. That the others highlighted about maybe that will bring another world war. Now, to my thinking, you said you don't see that happening, but you've not given us what are the solutions and your reasons for that not happening. Because the sharing and management of water resources has been a problem between countries, especially sharing the same river. In the recent happenings of flood, one major problem is because we've not addressed the issue of the theory of externalities in sharing commodities that goes from one place to another. Now, water goes down from one country to another, and the upstream country decides to dam the water, which makes it less available to the downstream country. What are the institutional legal framework for addressing such issues? Now, that's the external diseconomies of it. Now, the other one is upstream dams the river, and suddenly it releases the water from the river that causes a flow to the downstream. It happens between Nigeria and Cameroon last year, for example, as a release of the water from Lake Nyos. Okay, and what are the legal and institutional framework for addressing such issues? And I think we need to go beyond just thinking the way we are doing, and maybe address those issues and looking at the legal aspects of it in the sharing of water resources and the prices for external economies and the prices for external diseconomies. Thank you.
Thank you. Anders, do you want to quickly respond to that? And then I think Gidon will have something to say on that as well in your remarks.
Sure. Maybe I wasn't clear in my response earlier. Why not a water war in the future? Well, I would say there are a few reasons. One being the virtual water aspects, the one I mentioned, that it makes more economic sense to import, thousands of cubic meters of water in the form of wheat or rice or whatever it is, or think of your suit also required quite a lot of water to produce. So that's one reason. Another reason would be that it's very hard to see a country winning a water war. How would you win it? If you invade another country under international lawyers, you still have to provide water for those citizens that you conquer. That's not maybe a convincing argument, but that's at least one rational argument. Then a third argument would be that it's not always the fact that there's a river, there's one upstream country and there's one downstream. Often a river is a border between the two countries, which means that they're interdependent on it, or it comes from one country, enters into another, and then goes back into the same country. Then it's more challenging. The legal basis. Well, the best thing is to have an agreement. In many cases, there aren't agreements. About 2/3 of the rivers do lack agreements. So that's the best way, of course. But then there is the international law, but that's of course not binding unless you agree to it. That's the short response.
Let's keep it at that for now.
Yeah.
Gidon, you're on. I think you'll have something to add to this discussion.
So thank you very much, John, and also thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to bring in an element of civil society and the role that civil society has to play in advancing the rule of law, good governance, transparency in this sector, because I think that the water sector actually presents a very powerful avenue for advancing rule of law. And I loved your example of the village. So I think of a village that we work with, and I should introduce myself. I come from civil society. I'm the Israeli director of a regional organization that's made up of Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians. And we work out of our 3 offices in Israel, in Palestine, and in Jordan. So I'm thinking of a village, and the village is called Batir. It has some springs. It's a beautiful village that has developed over 4,000 years, utilizing its springs to capture water in a reservoir, probably built in the Roman period, and then has a set of canals that move that water to terraced agricultural fields. The terraces themselves were actually built by people over thousands of years. Now, the village of Batir was in the New York Times about a year ago. It has 8 days a week because the village has 8 families that depend on that water resource. And they divide their water with the old man of the village, measuring with a stick until today. The depth of the water in the reservoir, and in that way dividing the water to each one of the families. But unfortunately, the water from the spring only provides water for agriculture. And when it comes to their domestic water needs, the village relies on municipal supply. So that the village example, whether it was a just or fair example, is, I think, also still questionable, because new families coming into the village, well, how do you deal with them? And is it automatic that the village would suddenly start dividing water fairly? Not necessarily, and I can come back to that. So that I think in today's world, we can't rely on the village infrastructure alone. And although we absolutely need strong government
in this sector, and I would argue also a strong presence of the business community in order to keep the players honest, in order to help promote principles of good governance, fairness, justice in the water sector. You need today a strong civil society element, whether it's NGOs or local community groups or whatever, and that beyond the civil society, which are service providers, I would argue that this sector strongly needs to benefit, strongly requires more advocacy NGOs. And I want to speak to two sectors where I think advocacy NGOs or advocacy civil society organizations play a crucial role. And I'll speak to the examples of the Middle East because that's where I work. I'm not trying to pinpoint unfairly one region or another. But I was asked to give concrete examples. So firstly, it's the role of the watchdog. And advocacy and NGOs have a crucial role in playing the watchdog to make sure that good governance principles, transparency, sustainability is in place. So if you look to the Middle East, where at least the Near East, where I live, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, where Friends of the Earth operate, well, some people would simply say, well, it's an issue of water scarcity. We just need to produce more water, and everyone will be happy. So we would argue that, yes, new water, more water, whether it be through desalination or other means of increased efficiency, is an absolute crucial role to sustainability, but it's insufficient. And I would give Israel as the classic example. Probably the most efficient water user in the world, with some of the most advanced technologies anywhere. Today leading in desalination, with membrane technology being very much homegrown. But new water, and today Israel is fortunate to be relatively plentiful in its water supply. That doesn't equate to sustainability, because if you're not sharing water fairly with your neighbors, and in the case of Israel that's with Palestinians, and if you're not sharing water fairly with nature, and we would argue that resources for the Jordan River, for other natural ecosystems, both shared cross-border and internal to Israel, are not on the table sufficiently, and therefore sustainability is not there. I would say, similarly to the case of Palestine, the easy answer is to say that, you know, Palestinians need to receive more water from Israelis, and that's the end of the problem. Well, it's not the end of the problem. And NGOs have a very important role to highlight the inefficiencies in the Palestinian water economy, the failure to deal with pricing and accountability, feudal systems. So, you know, the case of Batir is somewhat of a feudal system, in fact, because new families that have come in don't get rights to water. They have to borrow or sort of purchase water from the existing families, and in exchange sell them half the produce that they produce. So is that a fair system? I would argue no. And the role of advocacy NGOs are to expose that. And, you know, a further example of Jordan, I would argue the famous canal that's being proposed from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, that Jordan is the most vocal advocate in its favor. While, yes, new water and the Red Dead might undoubtedly bring a lot of water into the system, beyond the environmental concerns, if pressure is not placed on a much more sustainable water economy within Jordan, within the country, where 40–50% of the water is lost because of inefficient, lack of investment, theft, lack of metering from families that are able to access scarce water resources without having to be accountable to anyone for those water resources. Well, if you don't deal with those harder issues, then the simple solution of just increasing the pie is no solution at all, because in the end, you constantly have to continue to increase the pie because there's no limit to the amount of water that people would like to consume. The other aspect, and I think that this is why rule of law intervention through advocacy NGOs is so profitable in the water sector, perhaps more than other sectors, is that in the water sector, it's very tangible. Water is something, it's the basis of life, but you can touch it. You smell the pollution. And I can tell you that I spend a lot of time visiting heavily polluted areas of raw sewage. It's extraordinarily tangible, and therefore it is an issue that can empower individuals to help create political will, to turn the situation around. And our work, we're 20 years in existence, but in the last 12 years, we've developed a program that Anders mentioned of cross-border community cooperation called a Good Water Neighbours program that works at the community level with schools, with adults, with mayors on either side of shared borders, Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Jordanian, Palestinian-Jordanian, where we've seen real change take place because water is so crucial to people's lives that if you empower, if you help them to demand their rights when it comes to water issues, you help create political will. So, I can think of a classic photo that I often show. I should have brought it here with me, of the mayors of the Jordan River, the lower Jordan, from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli together. The photo is the mayors jumping into a clean stretch of that river. It's not a pretty sight because they tend to be all male and they have big bellies. They need diets, but nevertheless, it's an important sight because, as you know, Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian government officials have lots of dispute. There's a lot of animosity. There's deep conflict still in the region. Yet these mayors are jumping into the water together, the shared water, not because they're best friends, but because there has been actions where their community, their own residents, have called them to account. And they've highlighted to their mayors, we can't wait. We need our water now. We need to stop pollution of our water resources now. And therefore, we're calling on you to cooperate with the enemy, not because you're doing the enemy, the so-called enemy, a favor. It's because it's in your interest. It's in our interest as residents to solve these issues. So the Jordan River is slowly being rehabilitated, and for the very first time in 50 years, and I give credit here to Israel, water is being released today. Despite, I could say 2 years ago, a former Israeli water commissioner said to me, show me your hand, Gidon. When hair grows on your palm, that's when fresh water will flow down the Jordan River. I have no hair on my palm. And it's not because the commissioner was mean, but the frame, the mindset was, no, that would be a waste of water. There's other needs, and water for nature can wait. Well, creating political will changed that reality, and desalination, of course, and other, increasing the water supply. But more farmers. There were farmers that wanted more water too. And there were other natural resources that required water. Why did the water go to the Jordan? Because there was political will created to bring that water. I also would like to speak again of the village of Batir from a more cross-boundary perspective. Because the uniqueness of that village that sits on the Green Line, whose terraced agricultural fields that should be a World Heritage Site actually cross. They're on the Israeli side, they're on the Palestinian side, and they're on the Israeli side. They cross the boundary. They don't respect borders. 4,000 years of history, of course, never respects modern political borders. So that actions at the community level of coming to know and understand the water reality of my side and the water reality of my neighbor led to residents coming together, Israeli and Palestinian residents, calling for the separation barrier, the wall that was being planned to cut through the middle of that terraced agricultural fields. And because of the trust built over shared water, that wall looks like will not be built. And the Nature and Parks Authority have actually turned and changed their opinion and have said, no, the damage is too great. And the military, in the case of Israel, should reconsider building the wall. And the High Court, because we took this issue as Friends of the Middle East to the High Court, the High Court have ordered the military to look at it again. Well, it's a combination of change in attitude at the community level, using the rule of law, in this case, the High Court itself, and the result is that opportunities for completely reconsidering what security is about. My last example is the opportunity that water places way beyond just water supply, sanitation issues, but as an impetus to move forward the peace process itself between Israelis and Palestinians. And we recently launched a campaign that water cannot wait, for the bigger picture, that of the 5 final status issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, water presents itself as something that is solvable, and therefore it should be solved now. Not that the other issues can wait for a great period of time, but if there is something, and of course they should be solved, but if there is something we can solve today that is an issue of animosity, then we should solve it so that we start creating the basis for trust building that helps us to then move on quickly to solve other final status issues. So the example of water, and with this I close, is that water is a powerful tool because of its concrete nature. It's so tangible that it suits, indeed, as John started in his example, it very much helps advance the rule of law, the governance issues, because when there is much intervention, and I think, in this case, civil society, community work is absolutely crucial. When people are empowered to work on water, they become empowered to work on a broad range of rule of law, governance, justice issues. And therefore, I'm really delighted that the organizers identified water for the first time, I believe, in these various forums held, that water truly is a multiplier impact that needs to serve the community of rule of law, governance, justice community. So thank you for that.
Here. Thank you, Gidon. Thank you. Quick, urgent questions for Gidon. Yes, sir. Up in front and then in the back there. Is there a mic? Thanks, Bethany.
Thank you very much. My name is Ernest. I'm from Conserve Africa. I want to ask the question about civil society role in the water and sanitation. There is still problems of water and sanitation in developing countries, and for now, you have highlighted the role of civil society at the community level. I just want to know whether you have any thought about the role of civil society at the international level, because as you know, we have, for example, in sustainable development, we have a convention on biological diversity, we have a convention on climate change, and a convention on desertification, but there was any convention on water. Do you think that the lack of investment in the water is because there has no convention on water? Going to the role of civil society, do you think that the civil society have failed because they have tried to advocate for the convention on water and it has never been agreed by the international community? Maybe that could be the cause of continuous having problems of water and sanitation in developing countries. So how can civil society can make sure that maybe in the future, in 10 years or 5 years, there is a convention on water which can help poor countries to get funding through that system, as it has been done in climate change, in the Convention on Biodiversity and the Convention on Desertification. So in summary, I think that there is lack of commitment of international community to tackle the problem of water and sanitation in developing countries, which is demonstrated by the lack of those instruments. So do you think that the civil society has failed to bring the problem of water, sanitation from the local level to the international level? Thank you.
Great. Gidon, would you mind taking notes on this? Because I want to get these two other questions in, and then would you mind addressing all three of them at once? And do you want to go to Angela next, and then maybe the fellow in the back?
Thank you. Angela Ciccolo from the U.S. I actually had two questions for any of the panelists, and I'll make them quick. The first was whether or not there have been any surprising legal or regulatory barriers that you faced in this area that you might share with us. And then my second question relates to technology. There are many new technologies for doing amazing things with water conservation and cleanliness and sanitation. I wondered if you have any experience where patents or other protected technologies have actually prevented the spread of this technology to people who need it, and how the spread of that technology is progressing. Is it by agreement? Is it by private agreement? Is it by government agreement?
Great. Thanks, Angela. And in the back there?
Thank you. Scott Fulton from the Environmental Law Institute. Two quick questions. One is, I was challenged in listening to your presentation to think again about the situation in Cameroon that we had described. In Israel, you've got government infrastructure, you have economic resources that are available, you're dealing with a political issue, an imbalance in services and availability, those kinds of questions. But it would be useful to hear whether you have any thoughts or suggestions based on the positive experience you've had with engagement in your setting for this very difficult problem that emerges in the rural areas and the developing world, particularly on the continent of Africa. The other question is just a question for the group more generally, and that is whether you think it would be useful for an organization like the World Justice Project in the construction of its index to add access to water and possibly responsible use of transboundary water resources to either its fundamental rights section of its indexing work, or if there are to be environmental metrics that are added to provide for those considerations there. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Gidon, if you wouldn't mind addressing what you can address of that.
Sure.
And then I want to get to Scott next, and then we'll take some of the broader questions for the whole panel, and I'll get to you next.
So the issue of international conventions and the role of civil society at the international level, WWF in the convention that Anders mentioned has really played an outstanding role. But I would say that the most important, well, we cannot do without a strong civil society in all our countries, because politics is local, and politics is local everywhere. So if we don't have a strong civil society in all of our countries, then the international frameworks can be nice on paper, but poorly implemented on the ground. So, you know, you have ridiculous situations where, say, the former government of Libya signed every treaty imaginable. What was the impact? I would say next to nothing, because there was no accountability on the ground. And that's why, you know, supporting civil society advocacy and helping to develop those at the national level are absolutely prime, while the international conventions are important, but will only be implemented if there is good governance at the national level to begin with. So one cannot replace the other. In the end, though, the responsibility does fall on governments. They're the elected or the representative of the people. Civil society, I think we well understand our role, that we're not elected, that we can argue the case, but it's the government that is responsible, and that's why I think that strong government is important, that civil society also understands and supports its role. I think in the issue of technology, it is amazing to see the types of technologies in the water sector that have developed, and they allow far more efficient, and I think it's particularly in the issues of efficiency, where there's been a tremendous growth, and we're able to grow so much more with so less water. The challenge is how to extend that technology, and I think the private sector has a very important role to play there, and financing to be put in place to help spread that technology to increase efficiency globally. But without political will, efficiency is not always seen as the first choice. I would argue that a minister would rather cut a ribbon for a desalination plant than support measures for grey water reuse for toilets, because cutting a ribbon in front of a toilet is not very attractive. The media don't come to events of toilet ribbon cutting, yet in most of our homes, a third of the water that we waste every single day, fresh water, we throw down the toilet. Mm-hmm. So, you know, technology is absolutely important, and we need to support it, but there's no alternative to political will to see more efficient and more sustainable measures in place. Maybe I'll stop there, so there's time for others.
Let me, and I do want to let us out, you know, at 4:20 or so we can all get to the next plenary. I'm going to actually, conscious of the time here, Scott, turn to you next, rather than deliver a few minutes of remarks that I was thinking of. Let me just share with you, WASH Advocates, my organization, is a nonprofit advocacy group in Washington, D.C., dedicated entirely to the global WASH challenge, Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene challenge. We're fully funded by 4 private philanthropists since 2005. So we want to be a resource, and I wonder, the gentleman at the back there asked the question about this, you know, should water be added to the Rule of Law Index? I don't know, but I'd welcome the other panelists and your ideas about whether or not that's a good idea, and it's certainly something that I'd like to explore. The key issue for me, we've talked about how this is a grave problem, we've talked how it's a solvable problem up here. The panelists so far in some of your interventions have talked about not just how it's solvable, but how it's being solved. And I wanted to give you, in about a minute, 3 or 4 examples of solutions underway around the world that bridge these two worlds of rule of law and water. You know, the first is that rule of law is making water more safe and more accessible. A couple of examples: adding rainwater harvesting to building codes in India. Really, really interesting topic. It's happening. That's part of the solution. Adding community sanitation facilities to municipal development plans in the favelas outside of Rio. That's a real solution to a real problem. It's happening. It's being solved. And that's a solution to a water and a sanitation challenge that's being facilitated or catalyzed by the rule of law community. Community water boards by the tens of thousands, literally by the tens of thousands, are being strengthened throughout Central and South America by a private foundation called the Avena Foundation. These tens of thousands of community water boards are helping to increase the quality and the quantity of drinking water to tens of millions of Latinoamericanos. It's something that nobody's ever heard of, but a perfect bridge between a tangible water challenge and solution and the rule of law community. We've talked about the Nile River Basin Initiative here, where the rule of law community has contributed significantly to addressing some of those disparities and inequities. What are the next 10 river basins where that same approach and those same political commitments need to be applied? Open question. I direct your attention to the Sanitation and Water for All partnership, headquartered in UNICEF right now, whose #1 goal is to attract the attention of finance ministers to the water sector by inviting them every 2 years to a sidebar event at the World Bank annual meeting. And then the last tangible piece I want to show you is an election toolkit, how to campaign on water during an election. And I've got copies of this on the table there if you'd like. If you're looking for a good idea that's frankly almost very likely to fail, I'll be honest, how about taking this 5-year election calendar from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, making sure that this election toolkit on how to campaign on water is utilized by civil society organizations in every single one of these elections. It's capacity building, it's civil society strengthening, it's rule of law with water as an end. This is very, very difficult work, as Gidon just described there, and as some of the questions pertaining to civil society organizations attest to, but it's awfully important stuff and a very tangible way to bridge the world of rule of law into the world of water. Let me stop there. I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the things that I'm working on. And Scott, I'm going to turn to you right now for your remarks, please.
Great. I'll be as brief as possible, keeping in mind the time. And I'll start by echoing Gidon's comment that it's wonderful the World Justice Forum has recognized water and access to fresh water's role in a rule of law society and the rule of law generally. My focus is going to be on the value of water. And by value, I don't mean pricing, I don't mean water tariffs, I mean from the economic point of view, what is water worth everywhere we look around the world. So what does it cost to produce, and how is that reflected in major infrastructure projects and actual access to fresh water? The starting point for the way I look at water is we generally speaking have less access to clean water in major urban areas than we used to. And I think the reason for that is we've run out of cheap sources of water in these places. We're, similar to peak oil, we have less cheap water available. The amount of water in the world never actually changes. And so to the extent we have a water crisis, it's, in my view, a crisis of investment in providing, in cleaning polluted sources of water and in accessing other sources of water supply. So that's what I view as being the main challenge and main barrier to expanding water networks around the world. And the solutions aren't simple, unfortunately. The World Bank can't support every major water project out there. Governments, echoing Ms. Okeke's comments, can't support everything. And so these are extremely capital intensive endeavors to try to expand water networks in major urban areas. It takes the world's best engineering firms, it takes the world's best technology entrepreneurs, and it takes just huge amounts of capital to get these done. So, my focus has been through Waterfund on measuring the cost of water around the world. And to answer the question about whether water should be in the index Waterfund and IBM, to plug my company, we've created a cost index for water around the world. So for the world's 100 largest cities, we've measured what it costs to produce water in each one of those places. And the purpose, this may not be what the gentleman had in mind, but the purpose is for the financial services community to understand how volatile the cost of water is and what it takes in terms of investment to produce a unit of fresh water. So I would, I guess, disagree with John and advocate for water to be an element in the index. And it could take a variety of forms, but I would support that initiative. And I think also echoing some of Gidon's comments, he mentioned briefly the Red Sea, Dead Sea project, which is fair to say the most ambitious water engineering project in the world. Has yet to break ground and costs in total I think upwards of $30 billion. Well, 10 in the in the initial phase is about $10 billion, and to actually complete it is a $30 billion initiative, of which only a small fraction, $5 billion has been funded thus far. So that's why the project hasn't broken ground, and this is analogous to a lot of bottlenecks in getting major projects done around the world. There's often sources of funds for the debt finance, and the major investment banks, insurance companies are often not there for the balance of the funding, because water is fundamentally, from a business perspective, it's not great business. It costs much more to produce than what's recovered in water tariffs. So from an investment perspective, the return is not there for the private sector. And that's why the private sector, generally speaking, has stayed away from water. And John, I know you have a great statistic on the breakdown of sources of finance globally in water. Can I put you on the spot to just mention what that breakdown is again?
Well, sure. Scott and I were talking yesterday. I mean, of $1 that goes into water and sanitation programs around the world, essentially this is a global average, but 70 cents on that dollar comes from public sector finance in developing countries themselves. 20 cents on that dollar comes from private sector investment, both international and indigenous, and 10 cents on that dollar is from the international donor community, both public and private writ large. So the real money in the equation, in the game, continues to be that 70%, which is public sector finance, taxpayer dollars in each developing country. And again, that's 70, 20, 10 is a grossly oversimplified global average.
Thanks. Well, it makes the point that private sources of funding are hard to come by, and the question, from my point of view, is what means do we have from the business community to incentivize private investors to allocate more to water? And if you look at the capital markets generally, and you look at the areas in the last 25 years where derivatives markets and other markets have made the biggest difference, you'll see that just by having financial products available increases the amount of capital in a sector quite dramatically, and housing is obviously the best example of that in the US. But the point is, water is the least financialized big sector of our economy. There's not a single investable asset for private investors to allocate to, and water is of great interest. If you ask any investment banker today, they'll tell you that water is very much at the top of their radar screen for the next 15 to 20 years. But today, it's non-existent, and so the question is, how do we change that? And my answer has been, we need a risk market in water infrastructure, and we need to take large pieces of financial risk and like they do in every other big industry, spread it out among insurers, banks, and other large balance sheets around the world. And that is by far the most dramatic way to increase the amount of capital that's invested in water. I think governments are doing their best given limited resources, and I think everything that's been mentioned on the panel so far is absolutely necessary. Conservation, these are all parts of the equation, but in my mind the bigger question is how can we dramatically increase what goes into funding new water technology, because there's a lot of great entrepreneurial work being done in technology that will change and dramatically lower the cost of water over time, but none of that will come to market without water agencies and governments being able to fund and finance such initiatives. So I think there could be nothing better for the global water industry as a whole than to have a competitive market in water risk and financing water projects. So that's my I have a very sort of specific view on the value of water and how a solution could be is attainable, and I hope contributes to everyone's view on the subject, because water is a massive subject and you can come at it from a lot of different angles. Mine's the financial one, and I just don't think enough attention is being paid by the capital markets and the financial community to the problem. And to the extent it applies to the rule of law, it is in all of our interest to expand sources of fresh water, and in developing countries in particular, accessing capital markets is critical. Rwanda just accessed the capital markets with a $400 million bond issuance a few weeks ago. Some other African countries have successfully tapped the capital markets recently, and that sort of thing needs to continue. It needs to happen specifically in the water sector for a lot of these initiatives to take hold. So I think I'll leave it at that, and if there are any questions, I can take them.
Great. And the financial viewpoint was the biggest missing viewpoint up here on stage so far, so thank you for bringing that to the panel. I've been informed that this session officially ended 15 minutes ago, so let me do this. I want to get to your question, sir, and then if there were any urgent questions for Scott, and Ebele has something to add here too. Can we get to you? Is there a microphone for the...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, all of the panelists. My name is Yitzhak Alster. I'm from Israel. I'm an international water lawyer. I also consult. I'm also serve as the legal advisor to the Joint Water Committee and as the legal advisor to the Red Dead, the Israeli delegation to the Red Dead Canal feasibility study at this phase. The feasibility study is not yet ready. We don't know the final price yet. No one started to raise any money for this at this point. But I would like to make two short comments and one question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I think that one of the issues, the interesting issues, and I'm doing it in private capacity, not on behalf of anyone here. One of the interesting issues in the Middle East has been, or at least in the conflict area of the Middle East, that despite everything, people have continued talking about water between the governments all the time, between the Israelis and the Jordanians, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That has been going on all the time, and not so bad even. The second thing is that the water scarcity, one has to realize that the water scarcity in the Middle East is that severe that without new and additional sources of water, everything else will fail. It will not work. Yes, of course, conservation, reuse, everything is being done, and Gidon pointed out that maybe Israel is doing more than others, but this will never be enough in the Middle East because the population is growing and there is less water. Climate change is going to be in our disfavor, that appears to be. The question that I had to do with what Andreas was talking about the 1997 convention. I am not sure that the right way is to go to the 1997 convention because it's a general law for for 267 specific situations. So why would you join if you know it's not in your favor, the solution that the convention provides? There is a rule of law. The rule of law is customary international law, Helsinki 1966. Whoever is involved in that knows what I'm talking about. What I should ask then is, why should we not try to concentrate on the UNECE Convention, the 1992 Helsinki Convention, which deals with the environmental management of transboundary water resources, which is, I think, a much more important element of water resource management. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Anders, quick response to that, quickly please, and then Ebele, I know you had an intervention you wanted.
Okay, quickly on the 97 convention. Yeah, I mean, obviously not many countries think it's valuable to join, as only 30 has ratified. So there are obvious reasons not to join, because that would then require you to apply more of a rights perspectives. Well, without going into any details. The UNECE, yeah, it's different, and as you correctly point out, it's more focused on environmental management, which may be more in the interest of some countries, which will also make it perhaps more likely that some countries will rather choose to join that convention rather than the 1997 convention. Well, I'll be happy to talk more, but offline. Yes.
And Ebele.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Anybody from a developing country will know that during elections, the first thing that the politician will say is, I'll give you water supply. And immediately, all the women will vote for him, and most of the men will vote for him. But at the end of the day, they don't give you water supply. I think that it is very important that water supply should be part of the rule of law index. And that the report being done by the World Justice Project, you know, I'm very impressed with the World Justice Project because I didn't know that such a thing is going on. Their report should be circulated widely around the world so that those in authority will know where they stand. Thank you.
Great. Well, let me just close this up real quickly then with, again, thanking the World Justice Forum and sort of reinforcing what our panelists have said here today for bringing together the rule of law in the water communities. And I want to go back to Justice Kennedy yesterday. He was talking about this compressed time frame that we all live in right now, and he said specifically, rule of law depends on dignity. And on behalf of our panel, I'll leave you with one thought. It ain't dignified to walk 10 kilometers a day to look for safe drinking water. It ain't dignified to defecate in the open because of a lack of sanitation, a lack of wastewater facilities. So I'm inspired by Justice Kennedy's remark. Thank you all for being here. Thank the panelists. Well done for a nice discussion.